In the spring of 1944, Major General William Hayes commanded the respect of 30,000 men, held the weight of invasion planning on his shoulders, and carried a secret that could shatter his three-decade military career in an instant. In a converted Georgian manor house outside London, beneath the war maps and invasion plans that would determine the fate of Europe, he kept a locked drawer containing letters written in elegant feminine handwriting. Letters from Grace Thornton, a Red Cross nurse 20 years his junior, a woman who was not his wife, a woman whose love had become both his greatest comfort and his most dangerous liability. Their affair began during a German bombing raid in the smoke-filled chaos of London and evolved into a passion so consuming that it nearly cost the Allied forces one of their finest strategic minds at the most critical juncture of World War II. Troyes. This is the untold story of a decorated general who risked everything, his marriage, his reputation, his legacy, for a love that defied every rule of military conduct and social propriety, and the remarkable woman who loved him back despite knowing from the very beginning that their story could only end in heartbreak. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories that history tried to bury. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Major General William Thomas Hayes was 51 years old in the bitter winter of January 1944. A career military officer who had spent virtually his entire adult life in service to his country. He'd graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1914, just in time to serve as a young lieutenant in the Great War. He'd survived the hellish trenches of France, earned his first combat decorations at the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918, and watched too many of his fellow officers die in the mud and poison gas of that brutal conflict. The experience had marked him deeply, instilling both a hatred of war's waste and a grim understanding that sometimes violence was the only answer to tyranny. Bond's interwar years had been spent climbing the military hierarchy with methodical precision, teaching positions at various army schools, staff assignments in Washington, a tour of duty in the Philippines. Hayes had a reputation as a brilliant strategist with an encyclopedic knowledge of military history, particularly the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. His superiors valued his analytical mind. His subordinates respected his genuine concern for their welfare. He was the complete professional soldier. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Hayes was a brigadier general commanding an infantry brigade. He'd led his men through the brutal North African campaign, where American forces learned hard lessons fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps in the desert. He'd commanded a division during the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, distinguishing himself with tactical innovations that saved American lives while achieving objectives ahead of schedule. By December 1943, he'd been promoted to Major General and given command of 13th Corps, one of the key American formations being assembled in England for the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Hayes was everything the Army needed in a senior commander. Disciplined, intelligent, utterly dedicated to duty. He was also profoundly, achingly lonely. His marriage to Margaret Ashworth Hayes had been arranged by their families back in 1916, when such things were still common among upper-class families. Margaret came from old Virginia money, and the match had seemed advantageous to both families. They'd produced 2 children, a son who was now serving as a Navy lieutenant somewhere in the Pacific, and a daughter who'd married a State Department official and lived in Washington. But whatever affection might have existed between William and Margaret had long since evaporated, replaced by a polite formality that felt more like a business partnership than a marriage. Margaret had remained in their home in Arlington, Virginia, managing their household, hosting officers' wives for tea, organizing bond drives and knitting circles. Her letters to William were dutiful accounts of rationing difficulties and Victory Garden yields. His letters back were equally formal, sanitized accounts of his duties, carefully avoiding anything that might worry her or violate security protocols. They'd been living essentially separate lives for years, bound together only by convention, obligation, and a shared reluctance to cause scandal. Hayes told himself he'd made peace with this arrangement. Personal happiness was a luxury that professional soldiers surrendered. He had his work, his responsibility to his men, his duty to the nation. That should be enough. And then, on a cold January night in London, everything changed. The night of January 18, 1944, began routinely enough. Hayes had traveled down to London from WWII's Corps headquarters in Hampshire for a series of high-level planning meetings at the War Office. The Allied invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was scheduled for sometime in the late spring or early summer, and every detail had to be meticulously coordinated. Hayes spent the entire day in windowless conference rooms, poring over reconnaissance photographs of Norman beaches, debating the merits of various landing sites, calculating the impossible mathematics of how to get hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tons of equipment across the English Channel while the Germans did everything possible to stop them. The meetings ran late, stretching past 9 o'clock in the evening. Hayes finally emerged onto the blacked-out London streets, intending to walk the mile back to his hotel near Piccadilly Circus. It was a cold, clear night, exactly the kind of weather that favored German bombers. The Luftwaffe's sustained blitz of 1940–41 had largely ended, but the Germans still launched periodic raids, keeping Londoners constantly on edge. Hayes had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when the air raid sirens began their distinctive rising and falling wail. All around him, people reacted with practiced efficiency, moving quickly but without panic toward the nearest underground stations, which served as bomb shelters. Hayes, who'd survived artillery barrages in the trenches of France, wasn't particularly concerned. He'd been through worse. But then he saw her. A young woman in the distinctive gray-blue uniform of the American Red Cross was kneeling on the pavement beside an elderly man who'd apparently collapsed. She was trying to help him up, but the old man was dead weight, and she was clearly struggling. Hayes didn't hesitate. He rushed over, his command voice cutting through the chaos. "Let me help." "I've got him." The woman looked up, startled, and Hayes got his first clear look at her face. She was young, late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with striking features that even in the dim, blacked-out street made an impression. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, intelligent green eyes that assessed him quickly, a sprinkling of freckles across her nose that suggested she'd spent time in the sun before coming to gray. Rainy England. "Thank you," she said, her accent unmistakably American. "Russell Square station is closest. Can you carry him? Lead the way." Hayes scooped up the elderly man, surprisingly light, all brittle bones and loose skin, and followed the young woman through the darkened streets. Around them, searchlights swept the sky, their beams occasionally catching the silver glint of barrage balloons. Anti-aircraft guns had started firing, adding their distinctive crump, crump, crump to the cacophony. The woman set a quick pace, clearly familiar with London's geography, leading Hayes through a maze of streets and alleys. They made it to Russell Square Underground Station just as the first bombs began falling somewhere to the east. The deep boom of explosions rolled across the city, followed by the crash of collapsing buildings. Hayes and the woman hurried down the stairs into the crowded platform, where hundreds of Londoners had already taken shelter. There was a practiced routine to it all. Families staking out spots against the walls, office workers still in their business attire, soldiers on leave, elderly people who'd clearly been through this many times before. They found a relatively clear spot and laid the elderly man on a bench. The woman immediately began checking his pulse and breathing, her movements quick and competent. "Are you a nurse?" Hayes asked. "Red Cross volunteer," she replied without looking up. "We get basic medical training." I think he just panicked. His breathing and pulse are steadying. She glanced up at Hayes, and recognition flickered across her face. "You're General Hayes. I've seen your photograph in the newspapers." Hayes was surprised. Most people wouldn't recognize a general out of uniform and in poor lighting. "You follow military news?" "My brother serves in your corps," she said, returning her attention to the elderly man. "Captain David Thornton, 5th Infantry Division, 11th Regiment. He writes home about you in his letters. Says you're the best commander he's ever served under, that you actually care about whether your men live or die." "Your brother's a fine officer," Hayes said, genuinely pleased. He remembered Captain Thornton, a young company commander who'd distinguished himself during training exercises. "You must be very proud of him." "Terrified for him mostly," she said quietly. "But yes, proud too." She looked up again, and this time she smiled. "C'est tout court. I'm Grace Thornton, Philadelphia originally, though I've been in London for about 8 months now." "William Hayes," he said, then added, "though I suppose you already knew that." The elderly man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Grace spoke to him gently, explaining where he was, that he was safe, that the raid would pass. The old man, his name was Albert, they learned, a retired postal worker from Clerkenwell, seemed reassured by her calm competence. The raid lasted nearly 2 hours. Hayes and Grace stayed with Albert the entire time, taking turns sitting beside him and talking to keep him calm. But they also talked to each other, conversations that somehow felt natural despite the absurd circumstances. Grace told Hayes about her life before the war. Growing up in a comfortable Philadelphia neighborhood, the daughter of a prominent surgeon and a mother who'd been active in the suffrage movement. She'd studied English literature at Bryn Mawr College, graduating in 1936 with dreams of becoming a writer. She'd been engaged to a Navy ensign named Robert Clayton, planning a June 1942 wedding. Then came Pearl Harbor. Robert's ship, the USS Oklahoma, had been hit by multiple torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack. He died trapped below decks as the ship capsized. Grace had received the telegram 2 days before, Christmas 1941. "I spent 6 months in a fog," she told Hayes quietly, the distant explosions providing a strange counterpoint to her words. "Couldn't write, couldn't think, couldn't imagine a future. Then one day, I saw a poster recruiting for the Red Cross, asking for volunteers to serve overseas. I realized I couldn't just sit in Philadelphia grieving while the world tore itself apart, so I volunteered. Came over last May." Hayes found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone, about the nightmares that still occasionally woke him, remnants of the Great War, about the weight of command, knowing that every decision he made meant some men would live and others would die, about the loneliness of senior leadership, where you couldn't show weakness or doubt because 30,000 men needed to believe you knew exactly what you were doing. "Do you?" Grace asked. "Know exactly what you're doing?" Hayes smiled grimly. "About half the time. The other half, I'm making educated guesses and hoping for the best. But you can't tell the men that." "Why are you telling me?" It was a good question. Hayes didn't have a good answer. There was something about Grace Thornton, her directness, her intelligence, the way she really listened when he spoke, that made him want to be honest in a way he hadn't been with anyone in years. When the all-clear finally sounded and they emerged from the underground station, London was still standing, though new fires burned in the eastern districts. Albert thanked them profusely and shuffled off with some neighbors who'd been sheltering in a different station. Grace and Hayes stood on the street as dawn broke over the smoke-hazed city. "Thank you for your help tonight, General," Grace said, preparing to leave. "William," he heard himself say, "when I'm not wearing the stars and uniform, I'm just William." Grace smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then thank you, William. If you're ever near Baker Street, the Red Cross Center there serves absolutely terrible coffee, but usually has interesting conversation. You'd be welcome any time. She walked away into the gray morning light, and Hayes stood watching until she disappeared around a corner. He told himself it was just a chance encounter, nothing more. Two Americans taking shelter during an air raid, making conversation to pass the time. It didn't mean anything. He was spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Hayes returned to Thuy Thien. Corps headquarters the next morning, plunging back into the seemingly endless preparations for Overlord. There were training exercises to oversee, equipment requisitions to approve, coordination meetings with British commanders, contingency plans to develop for every conceivable scenario. The responsibility was enormous. WWII Corps would play a crucial role in the breakout from the Normandy beaches, and failure could doom the entire invasion. But at night, alone in his Spartan quarters in the requisitioned country house that served as headquarters, Hayes found his thoughts returning to Grace Thornton. The way her eyes had lit up when she smiled, the intelligence and compassion in her voice when she'd spoken to the frightened old man, the surprising ease of their conversation, as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. He told himself to forget her. He was 51 years old. She was probably not even 30. He was a married man, a general officer, someone who should know better than to let an attractive young woman distract him from his duties. Nothing could come of this except trouble. The wise thing, the professional thing, the honorable thing, was to put the encounter out of his mind and focus on winning the war. But wisdom, professionalism, and honor proved surprisingly weak defenses against the memory of Grace Thornton's smile. 2 weeks passed. Hayes traveled to London twice more for planning meetings, and each time he found himself thinking about Baker Street, about terrible coffee and interesting conversation. He told himself not to be ridiculous. He was too old for this kind of foolishness. Grace had probably forgotten all about him anyway. But on his third trip to London, after a particularly frustrating 8-hour meeting about naval gunfire support protocols, Hayes found his feet carrying him toward Baker Street almost of their own accord. Just to thank her properly for her help that night, he told himself. Nothing more, a simple courtesy. The Red Cross Center occupied a converted townhouse that had seen better days. Hayes found Grace in a back room, sorting through boxes of donated medical supplies, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dust on her cheek. When she looked up and saw him, her face transformed with genuine pleasure. "William," she said, and the way she spoke his name, warm, welcoming, as if she'd been hoping he'd come, did something dangerous to his heart. "I wondered if I'd see you again." They had coffee, and Grace had been right. It was absolutely terrible, weak and bitter and lukewarm. But Hayes barely noticed because they were talking again. That same easy flow of conversation they'd discovered in the underground shelter. 2 hours passed like minutes. Hayes learned that Grace had been in London for 8 months, working with displaced families, helping coordinate medical supplies for field hospitals, writing letters for wounded soldiers being sent home. He found himself telling her about his passion for Roman military history, about reading Plutarch and Polybius and Caesar's commentaries. She countered with her love of romantic poetry, quoting Wordsworth and Byron from memory. They discovered mutual admiration for Hemingway's clean prose and shared grief over siblings lost to the 1918 influenza pandemic. It was just conversation, completely innocent. Just two Americans far from home, finding comfort in shared interests and mutual understanding. But when Hayes finally left that afternoon, walking back through London's crowded streets to catch his train back to Hampshire, he knew with absolute certainty that he was in serious trouble. Over the following months, as winter turned to spring and the date for Operation Overlord drew closer, Hayes found himself making more frequent trips to London. Always for legitimate official reasons, of course: high-level meetings, coordination sessions with British commanders, inspections of units preparing for the invasion. But he also found himself stopping at the Red Cross Center on Baker Street with increasing regularity. His visits with Grace developed a pattern. They would have their terrible coffee and talk for an hour or two, conversations that ranged from the profound to the trivial. Grace told him about her work, about the heartbreaking stories of families torn apart by war, about wounded soldiers grateful just to have someone listen to them. Hayes found himself confessing doubts he'd never voiced to anyone, about whether his tactical decisions were correct, about the weight of knowing that men would die because of orders he gave, about wondering if victory was worth the terrible price being paid. Grace never judged. She listened with an intensity that made Hayes feel truly seen, truly heard, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. She asked thoughtful questions that challenged his assumptions without being confrontational. She offered perspectives he'd never considered. And slowly, inexorably, friendship deepened into something more dangerous. Hayes tried to deny what was happening. He told himself he was just enjoying intelligent conversation with a fellow American. He told himself the pleasure he felt when he saw Grace was simply the natural response to finding a kindred spirit. He told himself that the way his heart lifted when she smiled, or the way he found himself thinking about her at odd moments throughout the day, or the way he looked forward to their meetings with an anticipation he hadn't felt in decades. None of that meant anything significant. He was lying to himself, and on some level, he knew it. The first kiss happened on April 14, 1944, in Hyde Park after dark. They'd taken to walking together sometimes after their coffee, staying away from well-lit areas where Hayes might be recognized. That evening, Grace had been telling him a story about her brother David's latest letter, about some mishap during training that had resulted in a company of paratroopers accidentally jumping into a lake. She was laughing as she told it, and Hayes found himself laughing too, genuinely, deeply, in a way he couldn't remember doing in years. Grace looked at him then, still smiling, and said, "You should laugh more often, William. It makes you look 10 years younger." And before Hayes could think about all the reasons it was a terrible idea, before duty and honor and professional responsibility could assert themselves, he leaned down and kissed her. For a moment, Grace froze, shocked. Then she was kissing him back, her arms sliding around his neck, pressing close against him, with an urgency that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, trembling. "This is insane," Hayes whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "This is impossible." "I know," Grace said softly. "I'm married. You're 23 years younger than me. I'm your brother's commanding officer. If anyone discovers this—" He couldn't even finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the full catastrophe that would follow. "I know," Grace repeated. She pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes in the darkness. "But William, I need to tell you something. I'm in love with you. I've tried not to be. I've told myself all the reasons it's impossible. But I am. I'm in love with you." Hayes felt something break inside him. Decades of discipline and self-denial, crumbling in the face of this honest declaration. "God help me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'm in love with you, too, Grace. I don't know when it happened or how, but I am." What followed was the most reckless thing William Hayes had ever done in his carefully controlled life. He and Grace began an affair, stealing moments whenever Hayes traveled to London. Grace would book a room at a modest hotel in Bloomsbury, under an assumed name, and Hayes would arrive after dark, wearing civilian clothes pulled from the back of his closet, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. They would have a few precious hours together, talking, making love, pretending for a brief time that the war and their impossible circumstances didn't exist. Hayes knew it was wrong. He was betraying Margaret. Even though their marriage had been dead in everything but name for years, he was risking his career and possibly the entire invasion plan. If he were compromised, the scandal could force his removal at a critical moment. He was violating military regulations regarding fraternization and conduct unbecoming an officer. But Grace made him feel alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. With her, he wasn't the general carrying the weight of 30,000 men's lives on his shoulders. He wasn't the strategist whose every decision determined whether boys would live or die. He was just William, a man who could laugh and hope and feel and love. It was selfish. It was reckless. It was wrong. And for a few months, it was also the most authentic thing in Hayes's life. D-Day came on June 6, 1944, a gray, stormy morning when tens of thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Hayes's 14th Corps wasn't in the initial assault waves. They would come later, as part of the build-up to exploit the breakout from the beaches. But Hayes spent that day and the following weeks in the operations center at his headquarters, tracking the invasion's progress hour by hour, watching casualty reports come in, knowing that each number represented someone's son, or husband, or brother, or father. Grace's brother, Captain David Thornton, was with the 5th Infantry Division in the 2nd Wave at Omaha Beach. For 18 agonizing hours, Hayes had no information about whether David had survived. He couldn't contact Grace, couldn't risk anyone noticing any connection between a major general and a Red Cross nurse. He could only wait and hope and bargain with a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. David Thornton survived Omaha Beach. Though his company took brutal casualties, more than 40% killed or wounded in the first day of fighting. When Hayes finally received confirmation that David was alive, he felt relief so profound it left him weak-kneed. He couldn't imagine having to tell Grace that her brother had died under his command. Couldn't imagine the look in her eyes when she learned. By mid-June, 2nd Corps had crossed the Channel and entered the fighting in Normandy. Hayes commanded from a forward headquarters near St. Lo, coordinating the brutal hedgerow fighting that characterized the Normandy campaign. The Germans contested every field, every stone wall, every village. Progress was measured in yards, and the cost was staggering. Hayes and Grace could no longer meet in person, but they continued their relationship through letters. Grace would send hers through her brother, who forwarded them in official mail pouches, never asking questions, but surely knowing something unusual was happening. Hayes's letters went through carefully chosen, trusted couriers, hidden among routine paperwork, addressed to a cover name Grace was using. The letters became Hayes's lifeline during those brutal summer months. In them, he could be honest about the war's toll, about the faces of dead soldiers that haunted his sleep, about the impossible decisions regarding which objectives justified how many lives, about the crushing weight of command that sometimes made him feel like he was drowning. Grace's responses were full of understanding, encouragement, and love. She never offered platitudes or false comfort, just honest recognition of what he was experiencing and unwavering support. But maintaining the secrecy was becoming increasingly difficult. Hayes's chief of staff, Colonel Martin Brennan, had served with Hayes for more than 2 years and knew him too well. Brennan had noticed small things, the general's unusual correspondence patterns, his occasional distracted moments during briefings, his unexplained excellent mood despite the grinding stress of combat operations. In late August 1944, shortly after the liberation of Paris, Brennan finally confronted Hayes privately. "Sir, I need to speak with you about a sensitive security matter," Brennan said, closing the door to Hayes's office. Hayes looked up from the operational maps spread across his desk. They were planning the pursuit of retreating German forces toward the Rhine. "Go ahead, Colonel." Brennan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, it's about the Red Cross nurse, Miss Thornton." Hayes's expression didn't change, but inside, his stomach dropped like a stone. What about her? Sir, with all due respect, I know you've been involved with her. I don't know the details, and frankly, I don't want to know. But there are rumors starting to circulate. Nothing concrete yet. Nothing that's reached the ears of anyone who matters. But people are asking questions about your trips to London, about certain irregular correspondence, about— He stopped, clearly reluctant to continue. About what, Colonel? Hayes's voice was dangerously quiet. About whether there might be a personal relationship between a senior officer and a Red Cross volunteer. Sir, I'm not judging you. But if this becomes public, if someone with an agenda or an axe to grind decides to make it into a scandal, it could destroy your career. And right now, with the final push into Germany coming, the Army needs you. 13th Corps needs you. Hayes leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 52 years. The lines in his face seemed deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. I know it's reckless, Martin, he said quietly. Christ, I know how dangerous this is. But He stopped, unable to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. You love her, Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Hayes nodded, defeated. More than I thought I could love anyone. More than is wise or right or fair to anyone involved. What are you going to do, sir? End it, I suppose. It's the only rational choice, isn't it? I can't risk the mission, can't risk the men, can't risk everything we're fighting for because I fell in love with a woman I can never be with. But saying the words and actually doing it were entirely different things. Hayes tried to end the affair. In early September, as 13th Corps pushed eastward through France toward the German border, he wrote Grace a long letter explaining why they couldn't continue. He laid out all the rational reasons, the risk to both their careers and reputations, the impossibility of any real future together, his obligations to Margaret and his family, the potential impact on the war effort if the affair became public. Grace wrote back within days. Her response was brief. William, if you truly want to end our relationship, I'll respect your decision and never contact you again. But don't end it because you think you should, because it's what duty demands, because others would expect it. End it only if you can honestly write these 4 words. I don't love you. If you can write that sentence and mean it, I'll walk away. Otherwise, we'll find a way to continue. Consequences be damned. Hayes sat in his quarters with pen and paper, trying to write those 4 words. I don't love you. 4 simple words that would end the most meaningful relationship of his adult life, that would return him to the lonely existence he'd known before that January night in London. He couldn't do it. Couldn't write words that would be a fundamental lie. Because he did love Grace more deeply and completely than he'd ever loved anyone, including his own wife. So the affair continued, even more carefully now. They met less frequently, only when Hayes had legitimate business in rear areas where Grace might be working. Their letters became more circumspect, written in language that could be interpreted innocently if intercepted. They developed codes, references, to mutual friends or shared interests that actually conveyed deeper meanings, Hayes convinced himself. They could maintain this precarious balance, indefinitely, winning the war, satisfying his duties, stealing moments of happiness with Grace, without hurting anyone or compromising anything important. Then came December 1944 and the Battle of the Bulge. The German counteroffensive caught the Allies completely by surprise. Panzer divisions smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, threatening to split the Allied armies and potentially even reach the vital port of Antwerp. 14 Corps was rushed north to help contain the breakthrough and then counterattack. For weeks, Hayes barely slept, operating on coffee and adrenaline, coordinating his corps' response to the German offensive. It was the most intense combat of the entire European campaign, fought in brutal winter conditions against fanatical German resistance. Hayes was everywhere, visiting frontline units, making split-second decisions that meant life or death for thousands, somehow holding together the delicate balance of maintaining offensive pressure while not overextending his forces. It was during this crisis that the worst nearly happened. A reporter for Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, was embedded with 13 Corps to write a profile on General Hayes. The reporter, a young lieutenant named Richard Morrison, was bright and ambitious and saw his assignment as a chance to make a name for himself. While interviewing various officers and enlisted men in WWII Corps, Morrison heard vague rumors about the general and a Red Cross nurse. Nothing concrete, just whispered speculation. But Morrison's journalistic instincts were sharp, and he began investigating. Colonel Brennan got wind of Morrison's inquiries and immediately informed Hayes. "Sir, we have a serious problem. Lieutenant Morrison has been asking questions about you and Miss Thornton. He's talking to people who were at headquarters in London last spring, trying to piece together a timeline of your visits. If he publishes, I know exactly what happens if he publishes." Hayes cut him off grimly. He'd be relieved of command immediately, probably court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer. The scandal would dominate headlines at the worst possible moment, just as the Allies were trying to recover from the German offensive. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built over 3 decades of military service, would be destroyed, and Grace would be dragged through the mud alongside him. Hayes made the hardest decision of his life. He contacted Lieutenant Morrison directly and offered him a deal: complete, unprecedented access to WWII Corps operations, including classified planning sessions and front-row observation of major operations, in exchange for killing the story about Grace. Morrison, more interested in military glory and career advancement than in personal scandal, agreed eagerly, but Hayes knew this was only a temporary fix. Eventually, someone else would notice. Someone else would ask questions. Someone who couldn't be bought off with promises of access or career advancement. The affair couldn't continue, not without eventually destroying both of them. In late January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge finally ended with an Allied victory, Hayes made his final decision. Using his authority as a Corps commander and calling in favors with senior officers, he arranged for Grace to be transferred back to the United States. She would return to work at Red Cross National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., far from the European theater, far from the war, far from him. He didn't tell her beforehand. He couldn't bear to have that conversation, couldn't face the pain in her eyes. He simply arranged the transfer through official channels, then wrote her a letter explaining why. Grace's response, when it came, was both angry and devastated. She accused him of cowardice, of taking the easy way out, of making decisions for her that she should have been part of. But she also understood. She knew, as Hayes did, that their affair had been doomed from the start, that they'd been living in a beautiful, impossible fantasy that reality would inevitably destroy. Her final letter arrived in early February. Hayes read it so many times over the following months that he eventually memorized every word. "William, I understand why you did this, even though it breaks my heart into pieces I'm not sure will ever fit back together. You're right. We have no future together. You have a wife, a family, a career that's more important than our happiness. I've known that from the beginning, even when I tried to pretend otherwise. But I need you to know something. These months we've had together, stolen and secret, and impossible as they were, have been the most real, most alive I've felt since Robert died. You gave me back the capacity to feel, to hope, to believe that love was still possible even in the middle of all this death and destruction. You saw me, truly saw me, in a way no one else ever has. You made me feel valued and cherished and heard. Whatever else happens, whatever pain comes from this ending, I'll always be grateful for that. I love you, William Hayes. I will always love you, even when we're both old and gray, and these months are just fading memories. Please be safe. Win your war, defeat the bastards, and please, please forgive yourself for being human enough to want happiness, even when duty demanded sacrifice. Yours, always, Grace. Hayes kept that letter in his breast pocket, close to his heart, through the final brutal months of the war. Turin. Corps fought across the Rhine River into Germany, participated in the liberation of Dachau concentration camp, an experience that haunted Hayes for the rest of his life, and eventually accepted the surrender of German units in Bavaria. Hayes commanded brilliantly throughout, earning his 3rd star and promotion to lieutenant general, along with a 2nd Distinguished Service Cross. But inside, part of him had died the day Grace left Europe. He went through the motions, planning, operations, commanding his men, accepting accolades. But the joy, the sense of being truly alive that Grace had awakened in him, was gone. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the celebrations that erupted across the Allied nations reflected relief, joy, and exhaustion in equal measure. Hayes remained in Germany through the summer as part of the occupation forces, helping to establish order in the shattered remains of the Third Reich. In August, after atomic bombs ended the war with Japan, Hayes finally returned to the United States. He was feted as a hero, parades, medals, photographs with President Truman, speaking engagements before Congress. The newspapers praised his tactical brilliance and his concern for his men's welfare. Life magazine featured him in a profile of the generals who won the war. He returned to Margaret in their Arlington home, slipping back into their polite, affectionless marriage as if he'd never left. He never told her about Grace. What would have been the point except to cause unnecessary pain? Margaret had her life, her social circles, her charity work. Hayes had his memories and his regrets. He retired from active duty in 1946, accepting a position teaching military strategy at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was quiet work, far from the intensity of command, perfect for a man who wanted to fade into comfortable obscurity. He never saw Grace again, though he followed her life from a distance through discreet inquiries. He learned she'd married in 1947, a State Department official named Thomas Preston, according to the wedding announcement he saw in the Washington Post. Hayes told himself he was happy for her, that she deserved a normal life with a man who could give her a real future. Children, the things Hayes never could have provided. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Hayes would take out the letters Grace had written him, letters he'd kept hidden for decades, first in a locked drawer, later in a safe deposit box at the bank. He would read them by lamplight, remembering what it felt like to be loved completely, to feel truly alive rather than just dutiful. Margaret Hayes died in 1968 after a long illness. General William Hayes died 3 years later, in September 1971, at the age of 78. His obituary in the New York Times was extensive, praising his military brilliance, his distinguished career spanning 2 world wars, his contributions to military education. It mentioned his wife of 55 years, his 2 children, and 5 grandchildren, his numerous decorations including the Distinguished Service Cross, with oak leaf cluster, the Silver Star, and the Legion of Merit. It detailed his role in the North African campaign, the liberation of France, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. It said nothing about Grace Thornton. Grace lived until 1994, dying at the age of 76, in her home in Bethesda, Maryland. She'd had what anyone looking from the outside would call a good life. A solid 30-year marriage to Thomas Preston, who'd been a kind man if not an exciting one. 3 children who'd given her 7 grandchildren. A distinguished career with the American Red Cross that had spanned 4 decades, eventually rising to a senior administrative position. Recognition and awards for her humanitarian work, respect from her colleagues, and love from her family. But she never told anyone about her affair with General William Hayes. It was a secret she carried silently for nearly 50 years, a piece of her past that belonged only to her. Her husband never knew. Her children never suspected. It was a chapter of her life that existed only in memory and in the letters she'd kept hidden away. Among her effects after her death, Grace's daughter Eleanor, named, though no one knew it, for Eleanor Roosevelt, whom Grace had admired, found a locked metal box hidden in the back of her mother's closet. Inside were dozens of letters, written in careful masculine handwriting on military stationery, signed simply W. Eleanor read them all, staying up through the night, and by dawn she understood. These letters told the story of a love affair between her mother and a senior military officer during World War II, a relationship that had clearly been passionate, meaningful, and ultimately impossible. The letters spoke of stolen moments in war-torn London, of philosophical discussions and shared fears, of a connection that transcended the chaos of war. They revealed a side of her mother Eleanor had never known. A younger Grace who'd been willing to risk everything for love, who'd found joy in impossible circumstances, who'd been someone's entire world for a brief, shining moment. Eleanor did some research, matching dates and references in the letters to historical records. She eventually identified W as Major General William Hayes, a distinguished Corps commander who died in 1971. She found his obituary, learned about his career, saw his official portrait, a stern-looking man with gray hair and sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone who'd carried heavy responsibilities. And she understood why her mother had never spoken of this. Some loves are too private, too painful, too precious to share. Some stories don't have happy endings, but that doesn't make them any less important to the people who lived them. Eleanor kept the letters, eventually donating them to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans as part of a larger collection of her mother's wartime papers. They now reside in the museum's archives, available to researchers who sign confidentiality agreements and agree not to publish identifying details without permission. The letters are catalogued simply as the correspondence of a Red Cross volunteer and an anonymous senior officer, 1944-1945. Historians who've read them recognize their significance not just as historical documents, but as profoundly human testaments to the complexity of life during wartime. They reveal that even in the middle of humanity's greatest conflict, people still fell in love, still sought connection, still tried to find moments of happiness, despite knowing those moments couldn't last. The story of General William Hayes and Grace Thornton isn't a story of heroes and villains. It's not a tale of perfect virtue or complete corruption. It's something more complicated and more human than that. Hayes was a brilliant military commander who helped win World War II. He was responsible for decisions that saved thousands of American lives. He was respected by his subordinates, valued by his superiors, and instrumental in the defeat of Nazi Germany. These things are true and important. He was also a man who broke his marriage vows, who betrayed his wife Margaret, even though their relationship had long since died in everything but name. He risked his career and potentially compromised military operations for personal desire. He fell in love with a woman young enough to be his daughter, and pursued that love despite knowing it was wrong by every conventional standard. These things are also true. Grace was a dedicated Red Cross volunteer who provided comfort and assistance to thousands of people during the war. She was intelligent, compassionate, and brave. She volunteered to serve in a war zone when she could have stayed safely in America. She helped countless wounded soldiers and displaced families. These accomplishments matter. She was also a woman who knowingly entered into a relationship with a married man. She continued that relationship even though she knew it could only end in heartbreak. She helped Hayes betray his wife, even if that wife was a stranger to her. These facts are also true. The easy thing would be to judge them, to condemn Hayes for adultery and Grace for being complicit in it, to dismiss their love as selfish and destructive, to see them as examples of moral failure. And by the standards of conventional morality, there's truth in that judgment. But life, especially life during wartime, is rarely so simple. Hayes had spent 28 years in a loveless marriage before he met Grace, trapped by obligation and convention and the expectations of his era. He'd given his entire adult life to military service, sacrificing personal happiness for duty. When he finally found someone who made him feel alive, who saw him as something more than just the general, is it really surprising that he held on to that with both hands? Consequences be damned? Grace had lost her fiancé at Pearl Harbor, had spent months in crushing grief before volunteering to serve overseas, partly to escape her pain. When she found love again with a man who valued her intelligence and spirit, who treated her as an equal rather than just a pretty face, is it really shocking that she chose to embrace that love, even though it was impossible? Their affair didn't change the outcome of World War II. Corps would have fought just as effectively whether or not Hayes was in love with a Red Cross nurse. The strategic decisions would have been the same. The war would still have been won, but it changed Hayes and Grace. It gave Hayes a few months of genuine happiness and connection in a life otherwise defined by duty and sacrifice. It gave Grace the experience of being truly seen and loved completely by someone who understood her. It reminded them both that even in the middle of mechanized slaughter on an industrial scale, individual human hearts could still find each other, could still create moments of beauty and meaning. Was it worth the price? The guilt Hayes carried for the rest of his life? The secret Grace kept for 50 years? The betrayal of Margaret, who never knew but perhaps sensed her husband's emotional distance? The risk to military operations if the affair had been exposed at a critical moment? There's no easy answer to that question. Perhaps there shouldn't be. What's certain is that their love was real. It sustained Hayes through some of the darkest days of the war. It gave Grace a reason to hope when hope seemed in short supply. And it proved that even when everything conspires to make love impossible, duty, honor, circumstances, age differences, existing obligations, human hearts, sometimes, choose connection anyway. The letters that survive tell a story of two people who found each other in impossible circumstances and loved each other despite knowing it could never work. They remind us that the people we remember as historical figures, generals and volunteers, heroes and medal winners, were also just humans, with human needs and human failings and human hearts that wanted exactly what all hearts want: to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. General William Hayes and Grace Thornton couldn't be together. The world they lived in, the obligations they carried, the expectations of their era, everything was against them. But for a few stolen months in 1944, they gave each other something precious and irreplaceable. And perhaps that matters more than conventional morality would suggest. In a war that killed 60 million people, two people finding love, however complicated, however impossible, however morally ambiguous, was itself a small victory against the machinery of death. They couldn't stop the war. They couldn't save all the lives that were lost. But they saved each other, at least for a while, from the loneliness and despair that war creates. And in the end, maybe that's enough. But this wasn't the only forbidden love born in the chaos of World War II. In our next story, you'll meet Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, An intelligence officer stationed in London who fell in love with Klaus Werner, a German defector whose information saved thousands of Allied lives and whose past in the Wehrmacht forced Sarah to confront impossible questions about loyalty, forgiveness, and whether love can truly transcend the deepest divides. Their story begins on a rainy night in September 1943, when a knock on the door of an MI6 safe house changed everything Sarah thought she knew about enemies, allies, and the nature of love itself.